So my other question was, thinking about what you've said earlier, the there's a gold standard out there, and the gold standard in PBL says at the end of the day, at the end of the project, at the end of the research, there's going to be a solution to a problem. In theory, I have problems with that idea because as an educator and not as an engineer, as an educator, I'm thinking really the learning is really the overall outcome of the PBL experience. But the gold standard says you should produce some type of solution. So I always pose, well, what if the PBL experience is to solve world peace? And I do that more tongue in cheek than and sarcastically, and I probably shouldn't. But are we going to solve world peace? No, of course not. At least not anytime in the near future. But the point being is that do you see the PBL experience as really trying to solve uh, a problem, or do you see it more from the learning experience? And can you look at that as an educator? Because I know at the end of the day, an engineer needs to produce something. And so I get that. And I know other engineers get that. So what are your thoughts on having to actually produce a solution to a problem?
So I think in high school and in college, when you go through the project-based learning process, certainly the important aspect of going through that process is learning something. One can say that you would need a solution at the end of the project to be successful. However, it all depends on how you frame the problem. So if you're trying to develop a solution, and as you said, you can frame it as I want world peace, that is way too vague. So one of the parts of the process is to define the problem. And when I taught my students, I would always tell them, you need to define the problem in such a way where when you get to the end, you know whether you're or not you are successful. So I try to give them some type of measurement or some type of data that they'll have to take so they can take their end product, do some tests on it, and determine by looking at their definition of the problem if they've actually come up with a solution. So for example, if they wanted to develop some type of product that had some specified dimensions to fit in whatever. So that's a measurement, that's data, that's something you can actually write down and say, okay, well, we made these measurements or we didn't make these measurements. One of the projects that I just witnessed in the college is they actually developed a system to detect the hydrogen atoms in space so they could detect where the edge of the Milky Way galaxy is by pointing an antenna into the sky. Now, it wasn't really exactly a problem. It was more, how can we determine where the edges of the Milky Way galaxy are by just pointing something into the sky? So their solution actually was successful in terms of they were able to get data that determined where the edge of the Milky Way was based on pointing the antennas. However, they also realized that there would be improvements after the project was complete. So was their solution successful? In some ways, yes. In some ways, there could also be more improvements to make it better. So being successful in a project isn't just one dimension, it's multidimensional. And when you go into defining the problem at the beginning of the project, you have to look forward to what can you test to determine whether or not your project is successful, and then frame it as, well, we've succeeded in this portion of the project, but we can see improvements that can be made after this, which, as we know, when you buy your iPhone, when you buy a television set, when you buy a piece of equipment, there's always some iteration after that based on feedback from customers, based on improvements to the design. So I don't like to frame PBL success as you have to have a solution. It has to be more defined than that. Can you be successful in that one little aspect you're trying to achieve in the project, but also look at the bigger picture and see what other improvements could be made. Because I think if you make your project too big, too vague, like solving world peace, there's way too many complexities to that. And you need to narrow it down to a feasible definition where you can actually complete it within a certain time frame. So whether it's a semester, whether it's a school year, the teacher really needs to have some little experience in PBL, and it's a learning curve. There's a learning curve to realizing what the scope of that project can be, that you can complete it within that semester or within that year with the resources that you have available. So maybe you have some 3D printers, maybe you have access to machining equipment. The scope of the project is going to vary based on all of those factors. So having a defined solution and a defined problem is very, very important in terms of being successful with your project-based learning.